insights. So that is noted. And I wanted to invite everybody to use their cameras whenever we are in discussion so that we can see one another. And while we have our invited guests presenting their thoughts and reflections on the future of the field of scale-up, it would be great if you would use the chat box and submit any questions of clarification. But meanwhile, while folks are talking, if you would be thinking about your own responses to these issues and then be prepared in the discussion section to share those with everybody so that we have a concise and efficient discussion and get as many voices onto the table as we can. So please do be parsimonious in your remarks. So today's agenda, as I've sort of hinted at already, Elida, if you'll advance to that. So as I said, we are talking about key insights on scale up, on the field of scale up today, as well as future directions where we all think that the field should be heading. I noted in my earlier email in September that the COP's leadership is transitioning, and we will talk about that a bit more today. We'll hear from our colleagues from USAID and from the new leaders, which are at FHI 360, and we have two of them with us today. And then we will turn to reflecting a little bit backwards on the COP's work up to now and give any insights and suggestions for the future under FHI 360's leadership. And then we will proceed to talk about just wrapping up, looking ahead to the next meeting, and also recognizing E2A for this important body of work. So with that, I would like to get the agenda going. And right now we're going to hear from our invited speakers, and I will introduce them each in sequence. But before I do that, I wanted Rita to have a moment to really kick us off with her introduction on the key insights. This was her and Eric's idea, and to have this as our the final meeting that E2A is organizing, to have this as the subject. So let me turn the mic over to you, Rita, and please go ahead and introduce our session.
Sure, be happy to. Thanks, Laura. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for some of you. And it's really nice to see so many familiar faces here today. Many of you have been participating in this resource team for quite some time, probably around 7 years or so. Your projects, positions, or organizations may have changed, but your commitment and interest in sharing your scale-up experiences has remained strong. And thank you for contributing to our global scale-up learning. Today's meeting is bittersweet for E2A. We are approaching our project final 6 months, which makes today the last COP meeting under E2A's leadership. The field has evolved so much since probably 2012 or early 2013, when E2A, in close collaboration with IBP, led the establishment of this community of practice and accepted the secretariat role. Today, the need to work more effectively and systematically to achieve scale-up success is much more widely recognized. Without any doubt, this COP and all of its members have played an important role in accelerate that change. For E2A, this COP has offered a powerful platform to share in real time what has worked and what hasn't from our scale-up activities in Niger, Nigeria, DRC, Uganda, Kenya, and beyond, to learn, to grow, to adapt. In fact, I would like once again to thank everyone who participated this month in early September, actually, in our webinar, Synthesizing E2A's Scale-Up Learnings from Multiple Countries. That webinar really made it clear just how much systematic scale-up of evidence-based in family planning is part of E2A's DNA. It's a pillar of E2A's legacy, and thank you, ExpandNet, to lead us on that. Systematic scale-up is one area of work that we believe should drive the next generation of family planning programs. And that's what we are here to discuss today, the future of scale-up. We have brought together a vibrant group of speakers who are poised to advance the conversation about the current state of the field of scale-up and its imminent or promising future directions. We'll be covering topics like cross-sectoral learning, measurements for scale, social norms intervention, government ownership, health financing, and research, and of course, COVID-19. And how all of them, they intersect with systematic scale-up. I'm sure today's presentation will generate rich and exciting discussion to continue the scaling up conversation. So, without further ado, I'll turn it back to Laura to kick things off. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Rita. So we have a very illustrious group of speakers, and you know some of them, I'm sure. They've been longtime members of the community of practice, and others are new. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Larry Cooley, who is, as you know, many, the founder and president emeritus of Management Systems International. He is also chair of the governing council of the Society for International Development and the co-chair, together with Johannes Lin, also on the call, of the Global Community of Practice on Scaling Up Development Outcomes. So Larry, over to you to share your reflections and thoughts on the state of the field of scale up and future directions for us to think about. Please.
Thanks, Laura, for inviting me, and congratulations to all of you and to E2A on all you've really managed to do in these years. I mean, a lot of us have looked to you for inspiration, and I think we've not been left wanting. I want to begin in a kind of a strange, maybe slightly autobiographical way, with a little bit of reflection on my personal relationship with Ruth and Laura and with ExpandNet. Because when I started my own work on scaling about 17 or 18 years ago and surveyed the landscape, I have to tell you, it was kind of a lonely position. And literally the only people I found who were doing serious work in the development space were the ExpandNet people. About the same time was when Johannes started his work somewhat separately from mine, and we soon found each other. And so it became a kind of a three musketeers with ExpandNet, Johannes and myself, in terms of trying to look to a future for scaling up as a field and as an endeavor. And if I look at where we are now compared to then, it's impossible not to feel a great sense of satisfaction, and a satisfaction that includes a huge vote of thanks and appreciation to ExpandNet and now to E2A for the role that you've played in that. I want to say a little bit in that context about the community of practice, the related community of practice that Johannes and I started about 6 years ago. What our observation had been that by that time, there was quite a bit of work on scaling, but it was somewhat disconnected. There were efforts in the health community, which you all know well and had a big responsibility in producing, but there were also things going on in education, in agriculture, in nutrition, in water and sanitation, and several other areas. To our mind, those different fields were not speaking well to each other yet. Also, there were two rather different poles where this was taking place. One is what you might call the public sector dominated pole, which looked at the role of governments and NGOs and so on, philanthropy. And the other were the interventions that were focused much more on commercial markets and on the role of the private sector, a lot of that focusing on social enterprise. Once again, there were interesting conversations going on, but very disconnected. And so Johannes and I had the thought of trying to convene people from across those different silos in hopes, and in all honesty, it was a little bit of an, you could say, sort of a hypothesis on our part, that they would find common cause in talking to each other. And that's been a very satisfying proposition. The community of practice now has got 700 or 800 very active members. It's got 9 working groups, one on health, one on education, one on nutrition, one on agriculture and rural development, one on youth employment, one on climate change, one on scaling up in fragile states, one on the special issues related to monitoring and evaluation. And in each case, we found that there's something that the other can learn from one another. And although health was in many ways the first to walk down that pathway, I think Ruth and Laura would join me in saying that there's been a lot for health to learn from what's been going on in other sectors. For example, the education sector probably has the deepest experience in how to work with and through governments in a relatively seamless way. The agriculture community probably has the best experience in how to work with and engage commercial markets and integrate those with government provided services and functions. Maybe nutrition has the most to teach us about how to activate a global movement in the same way perhaps we would say climate change does. So the notion in this whole enterprise, the community of practice, is to let each one of these communities learn from like-minded people in their own sector and across sectors. And we've done that in a couple of different ways. One is by having an annual get-together, which is coming up in late October, to which any of you who are not already members are cordially invited, open to anyone. The second is that we do quarterly newsletters. We've just done the 18th of those newsletters. And the third is that each of the working groups holds quarterly meetings online, usually in a kind of a webinar sort of a context. As I mentioned, the annual meeting is coming up beginning October 19th. Anyone who is interested in that should reach out to either Laura or to me, and we'll be glad to provide you information on that. Laura also asked me to say just a few words about issues that I think are trending in the scaling arena. And I could have picked many, but I picked 4. The first one I want to mention is implied by what I've said before, which is that in many ways, scaling up is scaling up. In fact, I think it's a little bit in danger of becoming trendy. Now, you don't read a report that doesn't use the language. You don't have a conversation about development where it doesn't somewhere intrude. I personally think that's real progress, but I also think there's a little bit of a downside to that, in that if we're not careful, we'll lose our way. Within that scaling up, there's been a very active discussion about mainstreaming, namely, how do we make this the new normal? Namely, planning for scale, assessing scalability, helping people manage the pathway to scale. How does that become part of the way donors and other third parties really interact with growth? And you'll see the good, the bad, and the ugly when you look at what's going on that issue. And likewise, you see now a plethora of publications, toolkits, and so on. So for me, scaling up is a very exciting space, but it's now a crowded and somewhat unruly space. And so the next challenge is going to be to try to give some structure and some, not uniformity, but at least some thrust to what we're trying to accomplish. Second issue I picked is a growing recognition that the only 2 platforms that can deliver anything sustainably at scale are governments and markets. So unless people have a real strategy for mainstreaming into what governments do, what private markets do, or the combination between those 2, they probably don't have a strategy for scaling. We could go on about that, but I think if you really take that to heart, it has real implications for the way our project-funded activities engage with ongoing host country governments and the way we interact with private markets. Third issue I would highlight is an evolving role for philanthropy. And again, as I said, I think governments and markets are the main show, but the role of philanthropy in trying to shape that has really been shifting, particularly as people talk about collaborative philanthropy and big bets and things of that sort. These are interventions that really aspire to systems change, to moving the needle. It's quite different from philanthropy during most of my career that was focused simply on doing good, but not necessarily to this notion of system change. And finally, I would highlight the role of adaptive management. This has been language tossed around in development for a long time, but there's been an increasing recognition within the scaling community that it's indispensable to trying to take things to scale. If on average it takes 15 years to get things to scale, and that's almost never a straight line, then the issue becomes how do we basically build in real time and at least short cycle learning so that we have the basis for making change, and even more importantly, how do donors and other agencies really build in the flexibility that allows them to adapt. USAID talks a lot about CLA, and we in the scaling community would say, put the emphasis on the A, because the C and the L become empty promises without the A. So my 4 issues again, the scaling up of scaling up, the role of governments and markets, the changing role of philanthropy, and the centrality of CLA and adaptive management. There are many, many more, but thank you for giving me a chance to pick my personal favorites. Back to you, Laura.
Well, thank you, Larry, for the always immensely astute observations as a participant observer in the field of scale up and a real mover and shaker. So thank you so much for sharing those insights. And I think they set us up well for the some of the other speakers who will be talking, particularly about the governments and markets and how we intersect with those on our scale up work. So, but we're about to hear from Rebecka Lundgren, Dr. Lundgren, who's professor at the University of California, San Diego's relatively new Center on Gender Equity and Health. Rebecka is a member of the ExpandNet Secretariat, and as an applied anthropologist has been working for more than 30 years in the field of implementation science, and in the last 15 or so in scale up. And of course, her expertise is in family planning, adolescence, social norms, and gender-based violence. Rebecka is currently leading the Passages Project in DRC, funded by USAID. And the project is focused on social norms around adolescent sexual and reproductive health interventions. Rebecka may be talking a little bit about social norms today, which is why I was saying that we have a diversity of perspectives. And let us turn the mic over to you, Rebecka, okay?
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for that great introduction. And I'm really honored to be here and speaking after Larry. And I do find that I have a lot of remarks, have a lot of resonance with Larry with a few significant little differences. And I'm also really excited. I was looking through the list of participants, and I would say probably 2/3 of you have been sort of friends and colleagues or participants in the journey that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, especially sort of the team from IRH Georgetown, which is the organization that I work with on the Passages Project. So as most of you know, I've been working on scale up of pilot innovations now for about 15 years. I think coming in the space about the same time that Larry's talking about, when it was a very lonely field. And we worked at IRH closely with ExpandNet to work on scaling a family planning program, or a family planning method, a new family planning method. But now, over the last decade and a half, my focus has changed a little bit. While I still work on family planning, as Laura mentioned, I work quite a bit on social norms and behavior change. So my remarks will be a little bit now looking at the changing trajectory of social norms, and also, sort of a shift in my my work from a very systems sort of public sector based work on scaling in the family planning to more of a work on sort of social and behavior change and addressing other elements that affect, all the outcomes that we're interested in, especially thinking about violence against children and violence against women and gender equity. So I kind of concur with Larry. There's been a real change in the landscape of scale up. It's very much commonly accepted as an essential element of almost any donor-funded project, even if it's mostly there in name only. There's a lot more tools and guidance available. I think donors consider it very central to their work. Again, even if they don't have necessarily the policies and mandates that they need to really support it effectively. So our landscape has changed for sure. And it has also changed, as I mentioned, from a focus on very systems focus to thinking more about social change. So that's, I think, another change that I've seen and we've seen in this community of practice over the last few years, where we've had more members joining from different sectors and with different kind of focuses of their work. So I've also seen a really interesting, sort of the second area I want to talk about is a change I've seen in scale up practice. So to me, one of the most notable changes, also referred to by Larry, is this shift from a very sort of dedicated commitment to fidelity to the original program or innovation to a much broader idea of we have to be faithful to the outcomes, but we need to understand that in every scale up process, there's going to be some sort of dynamic process of adaptation. And with that comes a recognition that adaptive management and adaptive capacity are fundamentals of successful scale up. So as Larry mentioned, I think that's a very important new part of the scale up landscape that many of you on this call, like Joseph Petralia and others, have been working on, really focusing on that part of our work. And along the side of that is an increased understanding, I think, of the importance of really documenting and monitoring and understanding sort of the scale up process and the adaptation process so that we can support scale up moving forward. And there's some new tools to do that, such as ExpandNet's implementation mapping tool. I think that's something that people are increasingly picking up to do a good job at mapping the adaptation process. So to me, the key issue for us is I might even say the future of scale up really depends on building local capacity. And today in our world, that means digital and virtual approaches to do so. So how can we really, provide guidance and support and capacity strengthening around the world to, when we can't be there, working with teams, mentoring them in person. So really thinking about virtual and digital approaches to build scale-up capacity, really focusing on the strategic management of scale-up, not just the planning of it. I think that's something we've done a good job on that, but we really need to focus more on management. So I think, in the last year, I would say, we've all been experimenting with ways to provide virtual support. With some of my colleagues on the call, we recently did a series of Zoom workshops mixed with individual work to really support scale up of an intervention in Uganda. We'll see how that goes. I think there's a number of organizations that are focusing on testing, mentoring, new models of mentoring scale up. The Womanity Foundation, for example, has a project where they bring together implementers and scalers and do south-to-south support. We're working together with, Joseph and I are working together with the Inspire sort of movement to develop a roadmap process to help. Inspire is a package of interventions to prevent violence against children. So working with 5 country coordinating teams to develop a roadmap to plan and implement scale up. So I think we really need to focus our, considerable energies and expertise in this group on thinking about how to do that. Then I wanted to wrap up with just a few sticky issues that are still kind of in my mind. So we're still, I think, although the scale-up mindset has improved, and it's not still routinely integrated into pilots. So I often still see programs where the idea is we do the pilot, and then once we've tested it, we'll start the scale-up process. So there's a little bit more focus on thinking about scalable interventions. I think we need to consider more how to conduct a pilot so that we develop the information, the knowledge that's needed to support scale-up. So adequate documentation, better understandings of mechanisms of change, making sure that we're testing, with the resources that will be available at scale, and we're providing the evidence that policymakers need. So related to that question, I still think a lot about, what constitutes good enough evidence for scale up and who decides what that evidence is. So there's a lot of debates in this field, and I think it's something that is still quite a sticky issue. And then finally, just thinking about social norms change. So I've been working over the last few years together collaborating with a group of 9 organizations. We call ourselves CUSP, Communities for Understanding Scale Up Practice, and that led by Raising Voices in Uganda. And we focus very much on bringing social norms change programming to scale. And it's been in a response to a tremendous demand from donors to scale up the interventions that this group works on, things like Raising Voices, like SASA, Stepping Stones. So, there's other issues that I think have been neglected a little bit in the scale up community, things like, how do you scale up social norms change effectively? How do you do it ethically? And I think we've really looking more about social movements and scale. So some of the recommendations we've been kind of prioritizing are focusing on fidelity to values. That's definitely part of the ExpandNet framework, but sometimes that piece about values and principles and human rights doesn't always stay at the forefront of our work. So fidelity to values, consider who are we funding and supporting to do the scale up work? Is this international NGOs? Are we thinking about local organizations, women's rights organizations? So kind of being very thoughtful about that. And also remembering that, in addition to being accountable to the donors, we need to be accountable to communities. So what does that look like in our scale up process? And remembering to use evaluation approaches that kind of value the voices of everyone, not just maybe the researchers, but also we value the voices of the activists and the communities that are part of the scale up process. And then I'll end with a question, which is, I've heard Larry talk about this a lot, about that governments or markets are the only true, engines of scale up. So, in the social norm world, we think a lot about that question. And first of all, is that true? Are there other kinds of networks and social movements that can scale up norms change, faith-based networks, et cetera? And then also with the question of just wondering, are governments, can governments really own and lead the programs to transform social norms when many of them are the gatekeepers of the very norms that we're trying to consider and shift and, and evolve over time? So with that, I'll leave my remarks, and thanks so much for giving me time to share.
Well, thank you, Rebecka. Those are incredible insights for us to mull over for the coming years, I would say, and figure out how we translate our work into a clearer understanding of how to advance in these contexts. And of course, the different technical issues we're working on have implications for how we proceed. So, okay, let me turn the mic over to Meg and Nora. So let me introduce Nora. Detter is a managing consultant for Spring Impact, and she works on supporting a range of mission-driven organizations, social impact organizations, and funders on scaling social impact through consultancy and developing and sharing insights. Her colleague Meg Armishaw is a consultant at Spring Impact also, supporting the delivery of projects, both national and international, across a range of sectors. And they're going to introduce to you a new tool that they've been working on for several months. And I've been connecting with them over about how situating government as the owner and leader of scaling up processes. They'll talk about that a little bit more with you today. Over to you, Nora and Meg. I don't know who's presenting first.
Over to Meg. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much, Laura, and hi, everyone. Nora and I are both new to the community of practice, so it's been really great to hear from the speakers so far, and we're really excited to hear from the next few as well. As Laura mentioned, Nora and I work for Spring Impact, and the insights that we're sharing today have come from work that we've been doing in partnership with Village Reach over the past several months. Supported by a coalition of funders, we have co-established a learning network to share best practices for working with governments to scale solutions. And so the insights we'll be sharing today in relation to the field of scale up and our recommendations for the future direction relate specifically to the role of government. And it's been really great to hear that come up as a theme in some of the other discussions previously. So we really believe that to be able to solve some of the biggest challenges and have sustained impact at scale, it's critical to work closely with government. Many social impact organisations and funders ultimately aim to sustain innovations at scale by working towards government ownership of solutions. However, from the research that we've done, there are far too few cases where an innovation's impact has successfully sustained at scale. Government perspectives can often be diluted or lost. Social impact organisations may exit due to aid withdrawal or shifting donor strategies, and all stakeholders lack a clear and shared roadmap to navigate this process. This is where the Journey to Scale with Government tool came about, and it's been produced as the first tool as part of the Learning Network, really aiming to address this challenge. It's not sector or location specific. As we went through the process, this is something we kind of grappled with, the balance of getting into some of the technical detail versus being able to keep it broad enough and high level to encourage and share learnings across sectors and keep it relevant to lots of different groups. So what we're aiming to do with this tool is to put the focus on how governments, social impact organisations and funders work together through the journey to scale up sustainably, and how we can help partners navigate this journey in a systematic way by considering critical questions as they go along and to avoid common pitfalls. Another really key part, as you can see in the middle, is around the mindset shift that's required to shift from seeing government as a receiver of innovation to then being a driving actor and co-creator. So the tool is not designed to kind of be a quick fix that will suddenly make scaling up with government quick and easy, which I'm sure all of us aware is a very complex and convoluted process. But instead, this tool is to set more realistic expectations for those that are navigating the journey and to kind of provide a framework to be able to work in partnership to do this successfully. So today we're really excited just to share a quick snapshot of a couple of the graphics and a couple of the slides, but we'd really encourage you when the tool is published in the next week to visit our website or Village Reach's website to look at the tool in more detail. So the three key sections of the tool, firstly, setting out, this is kind of all the introductory stuff that we think is needed before embarking on the journey to scale with government. The mindset shift, what's required to shift towards develop collaborations that are transparent, built on trust, equitable and mutually beneficial. And then finally, the journey outlines a 5-stage framework to support partners to be able to approach this and navigate it in a systematic way. On the next slide, we just wanted to highlight 2 things before we dive into the insights. So firstly, how we got to this tool. It was co-created by government leaders, funders, and social impact organisations in the field. And in total, we've spoken to over 50 contributors across 16 different countries. And all of those collective insights have fed to the final result of where we've got to today. How to use this tool. It's very much designed to be intentionally high level and present information in a digestible and memorable way. It's designed to be used by a coalition of stakeholders. So part of the problem that we heard again and again is that often partners will work in their separate silos until the final point when something needs to be handed over or transitioned. But rather part of what we're doing here is trying to shift the mindset that from day one, it's about working in partnership and co-creating a solution together. It's possible to use the tool in a whole different range of ways. And as we spoke to different people, we realized the point they're at on the journey is really going to affect how the tool is used. And so here are some suggestions for different ways it could be used as a conversation starter, or to set a workshop agenda, or to assess operational plans in more detail. In terms of some of the key insights for the field of scale up, we're just going to highlight some of the kind of top 3. So that on the next slide, the first one around radical collaboration. We heard again and again that no one actor can scale and sustain a solution in isolation, and to be successful is to commit to radical collaboration, which means going beyond an organisation's own self-interest to achieve a greater good. So starting by identifying the key collaborators, which may be some of these ones on the screen, maybe a combination, or maybe others. But it's really about thinking about the different roles for each organisation. On the next slide, a key part of the tool is the mindset shift. So funders and social impact organisations will often initiate a solution and then bring in governments and communities too late in the process. But we believe that by centering the role of government as a partner and valued member of the system throughout the journey and shifting mindsets towards this way of working, it will support the process. So a quote just to highlight this: "It's less about transitioning a solution and more about government co-designing it from the start. When you approach it that way, the transition is sort of automatic. It increases the likelihood of sustainability and government taking on a solution in the long run." Finally, the journey itself, which is on the next slide, works towards the ultimate goal of government-owned solutions which sustainably address a problem. And through multiple rounds of co-development and feedback on different prototypes, these are the 5 stages that we ended up with. And the tool itself has a lot more detail underneath each, outlining objectives and critical questions for partners to work together to address each of these stages as they go through. But it's really critical that it starts with that identifying and building relationships and co-creating something together. Of course, it's not a linear process, and while these are kind of shown as stages, we very much heard that it requires iteration and adaptation, and this is particularly the case when working with government. Each context is very much unique, and of course external factors can change all the time. So a new political party being elected might change the strategic priorities, or you might be working with a government champion which may retire or move positions. So it's really critical to be essential and to be flexible in your approach throughout. I am aware of time, so I'm going to wrap up there. I think there's lots more to say on the journey tool, but if you're interested in finding out any more, I think on the final slide it's got our contact details and a link to sign up to the Learning Network mailing list for future updates. So we'd very much welcome any questions, and also would encourage everyone to look at the tool when it's published later this week.
Good. Nora, were you going to add anything, or that's where we're ending? Okay, great.
That's where we're ending. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was very exciting, and this is a very interesting and important body of work for us to know about. So thanks for bringing it to everybody. So next, without further ado, I want to introduce Brendan Hayes, who is a senior health specialist at the Global Financing Facility Secretariat at the World Bank, where he works on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and is a country focal point for both Uganda and Afghanistan. And we are excited to have Brendan here at his first Community of Practice meeting, hopefully not his last. Over to you, Brendan. Oh, Brendan, you have to unmute, sorry.
You'd think at this point in 2020 that would not be something you had to remind someone about, but thank you very much, Laura. And thanks everyone for having me today. As Laura indicated, I'm new to this group and really here to learn from you all and to understand the way other stakeholders in the sector are thinking about this challenge of scale up. I'll talk briefly about the GFF and how we see this kind of challenge of scale, and really building on some of the great comments that have been made by the previous speakers. I mean, of course, we are based at the World Bank, and we do most of our financing, basically all of our financing alongside the World Bank, and we do that through World Bank projects, through IDA and IBRD projects, which are programmed through government systems. And that introduces an interesting constraint on us. And it also, I think, introduces an interesting opportunity to think about scale up from the perspective of our clients. And a lot of the comments earlier, the comments by Larry about the importance of thinking about scale up through governments, thinking about the role of governments and how they interface with markets to support scale up, I think is really relevant to the work that we certainly do. And I think we have been approaching this in a couple of different ways. One is trying to support governments and their partners in this kind of decision space around identifying what are those interventions that are highest priority and what are those innovations that can really help bend the curve on women's, children's, and adolescent health outcomes. And that is, as Rebecka pointed out, that's a challenging space, that discussion around prioritization, not only where we may have gaps in the evidence or disputes over the quality of evidence or the external validity of evidence, but also often lack of information, importantly, on the cost side. And again, we are working within the constraints of government fiscal space quite often, and that's becoming more acute, I think, in the COVID-19 era, where we're likely to see a real kind of slowdown in economic growth and reduced revenue on the government side. And so, making sure we've got a really carefully brokered discussion and thinking through this challenge with our clients, I think is a really important part of this scaling up discussion, and it's something that we're really serious about working with partners on. And then, of course, I think it's also important, these points that Larry brought up around the kind of diffusion of innovation, the kind of learning cycle, and supporting governments and their partners about understanding when innovative or new approaches are ready for scale, when they're ready to not scale and be closed down, and when things need to be adjusted and course corrected for continuous improvement. That's really important. And then the last point I'll just touch on really briefly is, once these decisions have been made about scaling and intervention, I think one of the areas we really focus on is looking at how we get public resources and concessional financing into some of these promising innovations to really facilitate scale. And there's lots of different models for this. There is, you can imagine, an innovation around improving supervision, where there is an incumbent way for the government to go about paying for supervision. And really what we're doing is tweaking the implementation of that existing set of budget relationships and financing flows. But a lot of the innovations we're talking about, I suspect, are very much outside of the course of normal business operations. And governments don't always have good instruments to buy in these innovations. And for example, we've been working with several governments on contracting of community-based reproductive health and nutrition services across a number of countries. And this is because there's not the existing platforms at community level always to deliver a package of interventions. But in order to put together a kind of public contract with a group of NGOs or private actors to deliver services on behalf of the government, there's a lot of information that's not always available in the public domain about the quality parameters for an intervention, how to describe the intervention in kind of contracting terms, the importance of the kind of measurement agenda needed to make sure that you can have a kind of transparent public procurement process, and you can have accountability for the delivery of those results. So anyway, I'll stop there, but thanks very much for having me. Really look forward to continuing this discussion and looking at how we can better support our governments and our clients in scaling up high impact interventions in this space. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Brendan, and I really appreciate a lot of the issues that you raised. I want to just draw out that several of our speakers already this morning have raised the issue of evidence and measurement and accountability, and I think that sets us up very well indeed for our final speaker, which is Trinity Zan, currently Associate Director of the Research Utilization Branch and lead for research utilization on the R4S project, which you'll be hearing a lot more about, which is research for sustainable scale. Sorry, Trinity, you'll have to set me straight on R4S. Anyway, this Trinity has been working for over 16 years on these issues with a particular focus on family planning and reproductive health and research utilization. So you'll hear from her right now on those issues. Thanks, Trinity, over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's a huge pleasure and honor to be here with you all today as my 9-year-old likes to call them big wrinkly brains, meaning a lot of smart people. So I'm really honored to be with you all and excited just to be in this space with a moment to reflect back, having participated in this community of practice pretty much since its inception, and also really having been mentored and led along by a lot of the people on this phone call, including my great friends and colleagues at ExpandNet and IRH. So thanks for the opportunity. I don't know that there's all that much more for me to say, frankly, but I will just briefly mention the project is Research for Scalable Solutions. That is our name. So as you can understand, scale is a huge part of what we intend to focus on. I'll just briefly mention we're a 5-year USAID funded implementation science project focused on family planning and reproductive health. And we have multiple result areas. Elida, if you just want to show those quickly. And the reason I'm showing these is just so you have a little sense of the topic as well as the role of scale. So we're focusing on self-care interventions and direct-to-client approaches. We're also focusing on HIPs, and particularly the cost and cost efficiency, as well as scale and quality of those HIPs. Equity is a huge area for exploration under this project. And then of course, like everybody else, we're focusing a lot on COVID. And so as you can see, I highlighted in just a couple of places, even in the actual terminology of our result areas, scale is inherent. But more importantly, as an implementation science project with a mandate to both produce evidence and ensure that it is applied, so a twinned research and research utilization mandate, we're going to be keenly focused on the role of scale and evidence gaps related to scale. And so we're really looking forward to working with all of you in this community of practice to help advance that. If you go to the next slide, Elida, I just wanted to mention that having listened to everybody, I think that both FHI and this project R4S are really well positioned to hopefully help actually advance some of these areas that we've identified as there remains a need for more information and we need to make additional progress. The reason I say that is because, again, as an implementation science project, we have an opportunity, I think, kind of a twofold opportunity to, one, look at interventions that are being implemented and potentially identify tweaks to those to be more scalable, to Rebecca's point of the fact that there are still a lot of pilots going on that don't necessarily strategically and systematically take that into consideration. But also, of course, to help answer some of those evidence gaps, both about how to scale, but also questions about measurement. How do we actually measure whether indeed we are scaling and scaling effectively, as well as the cost that it requires to scale? To Brendan's point, I think that's there's a dearth of information about the cost of interventions at all, no matter what, let alone the cost for scaling. So I'm just showing what is the FHI 360 research utilization framework. So this is something we developed about 4 years ago and was heavily influenced by our collaborations with and our collective thinking with a lot of the people on this phone, again, including ExpandNet in particular. And I think it helps inform how we do research utilization at FHI. And in particular, this was an anchoring kind of framework for this R4S project. So by beginning with the end in mind, as we have all learned that we must do at a foundational phase, really engaging with the range of stakeholders who may be government, who may be private sector, who may be civil society, in order to understand the true evidence needs. And I think we can hone in on the evidence needs and gaps related to scaling high impact practices and other effective interventions and innovations, to then how we actually conduct that research, again, to be hand in hand and to include not just the ability to implement research effectively and to do that collaboratively with our stakeholders, but also to be overlaying it with that systematic approach to scale up. So again, thinking about, Rebecka, your comment on the need to really provide a focus, and now likely a remote and digital focus on building collective capacity to scale, again, I think we have that opportunity, and it aligns very well with how we approach collaborative research. And then again, shifting all the way through what we see as a really lengthy and important phase of the process, which is translating that evidence into practice, and looking at it from both a horizontal and vertical approach to scale, so that we're not just putting into place all of the requirements for a practice to expand geographically and to replicate, but rather to really be institutionalized within those systems and structures, be they public or private sector. And so I think as a project, we're really looking forward to advancing these fronts, and to do so with our partners, who I cannot omit from naming. So that also brings a lot of uniqueness, I think, to our project, and I hope that they will all be engaged in this community of practice. But we have PSI and Save the Children, as well as Makerere University School of Public Health, and a group called EVIDAF, who works primarily in West and Central Africa. And so as both researchers and implementers, again, we're well positioned to really facilitate this research utilization cycle, but also to be able to identify and answer practical scale-up questions, and then hopefully rapidly implement the evidence as part of further scale-up of innovation. So I'll stop there because I know that our time is short, but that's a little snapshot, and I'll be looking forward, of course, with a lot of excitement to carrying on with this community of practice in which we've participated for such a long time. And really looking forward to the rest of the discussion today to hear collective thoughts on where we need to focus as a community of practice and how we as the Secretariat can support that coordination. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Trinity. And I should have prefaced your remarks by reminding everybody, which you could easily have missed on email, that the R4S project that Trinity has just laid out in brief are assuming the leadership of the community of practice. And so you'll get to hear a little bit more about that in a moment, but hopefully now in retrospect, you'll keep that in mind. Thank you so much, Trinity. And thank everybody, all of you presenters, for your thoughtful assessment of the field and where we are headed or should be. And so now it's time to invite discussion from all of you. I invite you to turn your cameras on if and when you're speaking optionally. And the floor is really open. I think we can do some combination of just starting to speak because there's too many pictures. I can't catch them all. So the floor is open for everybody, anybody who wants to say something about where you think the future directions of the field should be heading, etc. And we will have a separate discussion, great Johannes, on where the COP specifically could head. But for the moment, let's focus on the field. Go ahead, Johannes, kick us off, please.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks to everybody for really fabulous presentations. I want to pick up on where Larry left off and actually where Brendan ended up, which is an additional issue which I think has been moving into the forefront of the discussion and sometimes even debate, and that is what I would call the juxtaposition of an approach that looks at scaling up innovation or interventions along some scaling up pathway, and along that looks at what are the enabling conditions that need to be put in place to actually make sure the scaling up process happens. And this is what a lot of us have been focusing on, including ExpandNet and Larry's approach, our approach at Brookings, and others that I've been working with. There is, however, the other side of the coin, if you wish, or the other blade of the scissors, which is those people who look at systems change and who actually sort of try to argue sometimes that systems change really is what matters, and sort of forget about this innovation and scaling up pathway business, because if you don't have the systems change, you might as well forget about the scaling up approach. I actually think both are needed and both have to work hand in glove. Number one, because systematic scaling up will sooner or later run into obstacles if you don't bear in mind what is the systems conditions, the enabling conditions, and how can you either adapt them or work within the constraints. On the other hand, if you're somebody who's focusing on systems reform and systems change, you better actually look at what it does to the people on the ground who are trying to support innovation, support scaling up through projects and programs, and figure out whether or not the systems change that you have been working towards, and hopefully successfully, actually has the intended effects in terms of supporting and bringing about the enabling conditions that are necessary. So the two blades of those scissors really have to work together. And what reminded me of this is actually GFF. Brendan, I've been working in the past a bit with GFF here in Washington, and I always looked at GFF as actually in some ways the perfect tool to do those things together. And I congratulate the bank and GFF for having actually taken the initiative to work both, as I understand it at least, and I'm pretty sure it's still true, both in supporting specific scaling up pathways for specific interventions and innovations and programs, while at the same time also supporting system change. And at some point, it'd be interesting to see how that's worked in practice and what lessons are to be learned from your experience. Thank you, and over.
Thank you, Johannes. So I have not seen anybody else raise hand. Please raise your hand if you'd like to comment further on either what Johannes or any of the speakers said or your own insights. I know that Ruth would like to say something, but show me your hands. I need to see something. Martha, is that you raising a hand? No, okay. I'm keeping toggling. So Ruth, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, well, I'll just make one point. I was very interested in the tools you presented, Meg and Nora, and I think in terms of the future, it's really helpful to look again at what are all the different tools in the area for scaling up that have been developed, and that have been developed perhaps not only in the field of family planning and reproductive health, but more generally in the field of the various development sectors and how we can learn from each other. I think that's a very important area to learn across the sectors and from each other related to the tools that exist. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Martha, please.
I do have, sorry, hi. I do have my hand up. I was looking for like a hand up in the chat box, but I couldn't find that. So I'll literally wave my hand. Just a quick thought. It links to what Johannes said and Larry and also Rebecka. And I keep coming around to this as well. And that is sort of this notion of systems change, right? Which we all agree with. But there's something also about systems change that puts it in a very linear way. Not linear. There's nothing. I think of movements, and I think Rebecka hit on that, like social movements are a way actually to scale things, to scale behavior change, et cetera. And that's a different way than systems thinking or systems change. They're kind of two different things in a way. And I think it depends on what it is you want to scale. But the one other thing I would just say is at PATH, our SRH program, our new tagline is actually, we make innovations work for women and girls. And when we say innovations, we mean both the health technologies innovations as well as social innovations. And part of that making it work has to do with how you articulate and figure out how that gets scaled. So anyway, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I was just struck by systems change versus sort of, social movements that also scale. And there's sort of several different things running in my mind. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I think everybody has several things running in their mind right now. I saw Larry has his hand up. Go ahead, Larry. And if you can also chat to tell me that you want to say something. Go ahead, Larry.
2 quick points. One is that I think this concept of systems is very elusive. Before all this work on scaling, I ran a program for 11 years called Implementing Policy Change that was self-defined as a systems reform program. The thing that I probably took away as the most compelling conclusion from that is that people use the word systems to mean super different things. And so if we're going to use the language of systems change, which I don't object to, in fact, I think it's the right language for a lot of this, I think we need to be very careful to make sure we're talking about the same thing when we talk about systems. The second thing is I absolutely agree with what Rebecka said. I mean, she put it, I think, appropriately as a corrective to something I said, but I actually agree with what she said. And I think we don't understand very well yet the role of movements. She focused on one really particular aspect of that, maybe the most important one, which is changing norms. But I actually think that's not the only place that movements figure in. And in this community of practice meeting that we're having in a couple of weeks, we've devoted one of the plenary sessions exactly to the role of movements and changing the political discourse around something. Namely, what role does that play in scaling, and what can we as interveners do to influence that? Precisely because I do think it's an important part of scaling a lot of things. And it's a place where donors are particularly uncomfortable because it's not technocratic in the same kind of way. And the people you're intervening with are somewhat more diffuse and lack a kind of an obvious leadership structure. And so figuring out where we intervene in a way that's both legitimate and efficacious on this, I think, is not fully explored terrain. I don't think that I originally appreciated how important it can be in scaling processes, and I do think it's a cutting edge issue.
Great.
That's what I wanted to say. Perfect, Larry. That's it.
Doesn't he do that all the time? Perfect. So great. This is really helpful. And I just want to point out that everybody on this call and in the resource team for the community of practice will be notified of the meeting that Larry and Johannes are convening over the last couple weeks of October and I think into November. So very soon you will be getting an email from E2A or me, Elida, about that meeting and how you can register for it and participate. So any final remark before we move to the next section of our agenda? We're just a couple minutes behind, but we're doing great.
Ryan has his hands up as well as Sada.
Oh, good. Ryan, why don't you go first and then Sada?
Sure, thanks. And this is just to continue to build on the conversation around social norms and social movements. But currently working at CARE, have been there a few years now, and we just recently launched the Impact at Scale initiative. And we identified 6 sort of pathways or strategies to scale, and one of them is changing social norms, and that's actually sparked a debate within our organization on whether social norms change is actually a pathway or an intervention that we seek to scale. So I guess this question more is for Rebecka and potentially Larry. I would love to get your thoughts on that. To me, I feel like social norms change in some ways. Changing minds, changing attitudes facilitates scale just the same way like changing policies does, but would love your thoughts.
Okay, how about Rebecka, Larry, just a quick response and then you guys could take that discussion forward elsewhere. Rebecka?
Yeah, I wasn't 100% clear. Do you mean sort of the mindset change? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I guess maybe when we talk about social norms change, we also talk about changing minds, changing hearts, changing attitudes. And do we actually see that social norms change as an actual pathway to scale or something that we're scaling in and of itself?
Oh,
Rebecka, go ahead. You're a bit echoey. I'm not sure why.
I don't know why. I think it's both is my short answer. Depends. Yeah, I think it could be both. It would be, I would love to talk about that more.
Yeah, I would happy to chat offline with you if that's possible.
Good. And Larry, do you want to weigh in?
I do, but I won't.
Okay. You can
but I would happily include myself in that conversation.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, Dr. Sada, please go ahead, unmute and tell us where your thinking is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura. Yeah. And thank you for the presentations, all the presenters. My interest, as in what Ruth said, is on the tool. And I think one of the basic insights I've had working on this side, scale up, if the emphasis that we always have on the space, more like the space dimension of scale up, and leaving a lot on the time dimension, how sustainable it is going to be. And I think it will be very interesting when I look at the tool when it is published, to see how is it looking at that angle. How are we going to sustain scale up, which I think is really one of the key issues when you look at trying to scale up through the government. You can do that now, you can have agreement with them today, but you can't be there forever. especially local governments? How do you ensure that they are sustaining what they're doing? Thank you very much.
And thank you. Good. So we're a little over. So I think we better shift to the next agenda item, which is to talk about the transition and leadership of this community of practice, because as evidenced by the high-level discourse today and the very important sort of soul-searching we're all doing here, we are giving over the reins to that leadership over to FHI 360. So Rita, can I ask you to speak a little bit about this and kick us off?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Laura, for another interesting COP meeting. And thank you to you two participants as well as today's speakers for sharing your insights and visions for the future to continue advance our global scale-up conversation. For E2A, it has been a privilege to have ExpandNet as our scale-up technical partner. And I would like to thank ExpandNet, specifically Laura, Ruth, and Peter, for also playing a lead role in the secretariat of this COP. As E2A draws to a close, this COP is transitioning the secretariat to another global funded project by USAID. As Laura and Trinity mentioned, the research for scale, I think that the R4S project, as we heard from Trinity half an hour ago, they will be leading this COP from now on. And we are very happy that it is another global project, that it is they continuing the leadership of this community of practice. We have assured Trinity and her team at R4S that both E2A and ExpandNet are committed to supporting a smooth transitioning. But this transition could not be complete without hearing a few words from Trish McDonald. Trish has been a champion of systematic scale up, an active member of this COP, and the long-term AOR of E2A. So Trish, over to you now.
Thank you, Rita. And I just have to say, wow, this has been a really incredible meeting and exchange of ideas and insights over how the sort of application and learning around scale up has moved forward since the inception of E2A. I was thinking back to when we were just in the design phase of E2A. And one of the things that my division within the Family Planning Office is Service Delivery Improvement. We had a lot of discussions with our colleagues in the research and research utilization division, and really spent a good amount of time trying to figure out how do we move evidence forward into practice? How do we really get it out there and get it scaled? And you know, I think the inclusion of ExpandNet in the Pathfinder led E2A project was absolutely brilliant, and it gave us a great solid foundation, as well as very explicit approaches, which many of you have mentioned today, you know, beginning with the end in mind, planning your scale up from the start, not at the end of a pilot phase. The mindset shift that really needs to take place to, you know, bring the government and or the host country organizations into that leadership role to move it forward. planning to have some short cycle learning so that adaptation can take place. And as the interventions move to scale, the adaptation process is also part of that. The very important piece, which is, I think, still probably needing additional support and help with, is the whole issue of costing of scale up. We've had some projects that have looked at the cost of it, and it's been truly helpful in terms of advocacy to governments to put forward funding to make these things happen. And the last part, which I thought was really important, and I think maybe hasn't had enough time in these project cycles, is really supporting the strategic management of the scale-up process going forward. And I know a lot of our project cycles are rather short for that, and so the concept of short cycle learning, adaptation, and really managing that scale-up process are very important to all of that. I would really like to take this opportunity to thank the E2A project and ExpandNet as a very critical partner in this award, and all that the project has learned and provided for PRH and global health within USAID. Very happy that this is transitioning to FHI 360 and the R4S project, as it really keeps our partnership between service delivery implementation and research and evidence moving forward collaboratively, jointly, so that we are moving towards that scale. And for those of you who follow USAID awards, you know that we've got this whole new suite of momentum awards, which have as a foundational aspect of it is sustainable scale up. So we really look forward to this next phase under the leadership of the FHI 360 R4S project, as they take over the secretariat role for the community of practice, and the continued interface between implementing partners on the research side and on the service delivery side as we move this forward, and bringing all of these incredible principles and insights that you've all mentioned today into the work going forward. So I just really am looking forward to the next phase of the growth in sustainable scale up. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. And I think that with that, it's really a nice segue for us to welcome back Trinity, as well as Erika Roftalin from USAID, to say a few more words on the transition. Trinity, first.
Actually, I was going to see if Erika wanted to go first. Do you want to, Erika, or me?
Everyone, sure, I can go first. I only have just a few quick things to say. I think everyone has spoken very well and eloquently, so I don't have a whole lot more to add, but I'm on the management team for R4S at USAID. I'm sure many of you know Mihira Kara. She's our AOR, but she couldn't make it today, but she does send hello to everyone. Just on behalf of the team, though, we're grateful for the opportunity to carry on the important work of this group. As Trinity has already described a little bit, R4S is well placed to take this on, as advancing evidence and knowledge for family planning and reproductive health is a core part of the vision and mandate for R4S. So we're looking forward to what lies ahead, and of course a big thank you to E2A, Trish and ExpandNet, and everybody here for setting such a high bar for us. So thank you.
Thank you, Erika. Over to you, Trinity.
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate all of the thanks that have been provided to E2A and to all of the members of this community for making it so dynamic. And I think that one of the things that I'm most excited about is the fact that it does bring together the diverse kind of stakeholders that are necessary, both for what we view as the research utilization process at FHI, as well as the scale-up process. So in the middle of our framework, we kind of have overlapping circles of knowledge producers and end users and knowledge brokers. And I think that that has a parallel in sort of the concept of the resource team within ExpandNet and Scale Up, and the fact that we need all of us, the research folks at USAID, the service delivery folks, the buyer, the government, the advocates involved in this process. And it seems that this group is really well placed to bring those folks together so that we can continue to share our knowledge and our learnings. And for us as R4S and FHI, we're really excited to be active in that space to facilitate that peer-to-peer learning and also hopefully to apply those to the R4S project, which, as I mentioned, has this keen mandate to really produce evidence and apply it for successful and sustainable scale up. So we're really excited to be here. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you both. The future of this COP looks very bright. Thank you. And anyway, on behalf of everyone at E2A and Pathfinder, we are excited to continue our participation with FHI through R4S at the helm. Thanks everybody. And now back over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Rita, and everybody. So, building on this discussion that we've just been having over the last hour plus, I think that we have looked at the sort of landscape of Scale Up and how the field is moving, very critical reflections, lots of key insights for the field, as well as for our community of practice. There have been sort of little ideas coming through about costing and research and the use of evidence as potential future subject matter for community of practice discussions moving forward. We just wanted to take a moment to pause and look at that, sort of looking backwards on any learnings that people would like to share from the community of practice's work. Please feel free to share any critiques and so that we can learn from those, as well as what you think might be some future directions for a modus operandi or technical topics that you'd like to see the FHI 360 take up with their leadership in future. No promises, of course, they have discretion, but we would like to give some time on the floor for that for this next 5, 7, 8 minutes. So please, the floor is open. Give any criticism, ideas for how we could strengthen the community of practice moving forward. Trinity saying, very interested to hear from the members about where and how we should focus moving forward, as well as what didn't work and as well as what might have been desired that we were not able to pursue. So, Johannes, up to you first, please.
Thank you. I just want to flag that there is this link between your community of practice and the overarching community of practice that Larry and I have founded about 5, 6 years ago. And my hope looking ahead is that this link will continue under the new management, if I may say so. And we've been our community of practice has relied on your community of practice to provide what we call a working group in health. And in fact, it's been a wonderful symbiotic relationship in the last few years, which has worked extremely well. And I'm very grateful to all concerned. I'm sure Larry too. So my only hope that I want to give expression to at this point is that we will continue to cooperate closely with you all and count on you to indeed ensure that the health-related issues in scaling up, and frankly, my impression is you're really in many ways, perhaps ahead of many of the other sectors and thematic areas in your focus on scale, collective focus on scale, that you bring that experience, those lessons and those insights to the broader audience and the broader agenda that we are supporting through the broader community of practice. Thank you very much. And thank you for a wonderful meeting. Over.
Thank you, Johannes. And I should maybe say a word about that, but I'll do so at the end of this session. Is there anybody else who would like to give input into past or future of the community of practice? And I'm afraid I don't see the hands up. Eric, my apologies. I was wanting to look to Eric first in this. Please go ahead, Eric.
I'll pretend I'm a random participant. No, that's good. No, just, I'm a technical person and I'm not a specialist in sort of scale up, but as a program person looking at the work that E2A has done, I know that from a very concrete programmatic point of view, there's a couple of things that we really, wanted to explore further. I think we see resource teams as being an incredibly important part of the success of any scale-up experience. And I'm wondering if we have given that, sufficient attention. Resource teams are, mandated to deal with everything from monitoring program performance to adjusting or adapting the innovation to increase the likelihood of scale-up, to developing scale-up strategies and mobilizing partners and resources to achieve that scale-up. But are we doing that effectively? And so I think some of the things that we really wanted to examine was, when it comes to the resource team membership, are we getting the right people? Are we really getting people from the beginning that have as their mission to do resource mobilization and to think about that, from the get-go? Are we getting the implementing partners, that can, sometimes it's our competitors that take up, this has happened to us, that take up an intervention that we have started, but they continue it because they see, the value in that. Are we providing sufficient training to the resource teams in terms of their specific mandate, the level of commitment that's required? The roles of the members have come out in several of our publications as being something that may not have been clear from the beginning. So what government will do as opposed to what other partners will do sometimes remains unresolved, even to the point that in the scale-up strategy. So really sorting that out from the beginning. How they're organized and structured, how they operate, how they make decisions, their level of engagement, their relationship to project management and staff. So anyway, that's something that we really wanted to explore more. And then the second one harks back to this discussion that Rebecka, first raised, but others have as well. Social norms change, but on whose part? And that's what I'm going to introduce here, is the whole issue of advocacy. E2A has spent a lot of time and resources documenting, different scale-up experiences in the hope of programmatic and institutionalization and expansion. And our documentation and on-the-ground resource work with resource teams has consistently led to the development of these scale-up strategies, which I've talked about, which have sometimes led to vertical or horizontal scale-up. The question that I have concerns the role that advocacy should play in these efforts and the timing of these efforts, particularly when we deal with topics that may be considered controversial and specifically related to the topic of reproductive health of youth and adolescents. When it comes to AYRH, we know that having compelling evidence that something works isn't always enough to sway program policymakers to choose scale up. We can see examples from around the world where national efforts to scale up sexuality education in Uganda, for instance, was met with resistance, with backlash, and even retraction. So it seems that, beyond the instrumental use of advocacy, which is the use of evidence, this also needs to be complemented by conceptual advocacy or working to change the norms of policymakers, their beliefs, their attitudes related to the needs, of young people. So I guess my questions are, who engages in these types of advocacy? Is it the resource team? Is it the program staff? Is it young people? Is it all of the above? And when should diverse advocacy efforts take place, especially on AYRH topics? So those are a couple of points I wanted to raise from a programmatic point of view.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So let me point out, so time is running fast. This is not your only opportunity to give this input. you should feel free to email myself or Rita or Trinity about your ideas for moving the COP forward and to continue that iterative dialogue as the COP rolls ahead. But thank you, Eric and Johannes and everybody for thinking about these issues. I will say, as I promised, that as Larry and Johannes mentioned, our COP has also served under two hats, where we've also been wearing the Health Technical Working Group hat in the development outcomes, Scaling Up Development Outcomes Community of Practice that Johannes and Larry convene. That role continues, that Health Working Group continues, and we've worked out with FHI 360 that their leadership of this community of practice will be closely allied with that Health Technical Working Group. ExpandNet will continue to lead that working group, and it is our vision and hope that we can expand the membership further beyond reproductive health and family planning to also bring in a larger group of health technical areas so that we can continue spreading the scaling up message with new champions and allies on the journey. So please stay tuned and really continue to be part of both of these working groups who are going to be close friends and allies moving forward. Finally, I want to take the last minute or two to give to Ruth and allow her to speak for a moment about recognitions. Ruth, can you?
Thank you. Yes. As Rita and Trish have mentioned at the beginning, at the time this E2A-led community of practice on Scale Up was initiated, the field of scaling up was still in its relatively early stages of development. And so was the idea of having a community of practice on Scale Up in family planning and reproductive health. And as other speakers have already said, much credit goes to E2A for creating and actively leading this community of practice and supporting its work for all these years. The result of which has been a great deal of learning on everybody's part, which I'm convinced has benefited many more people in low and middle income countries from successfully tested project interventions than would have otherwise been feasible. Thus, many thanks to the leadership and members of E2A who have made this community of practice possible. It has been a great pleasure and also a very important learning experience for us from ExpandNet to have been part of this experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And with that, I think we're ready to close on time. And just to thank E2A myself, to thank USAID profoundly, and to thank FHI 360 for renewing this COP with an exciting new energy and focus, and all of you as colleagues in this journey. So I wish you all safety and blessings on your work and your lives, and we will continue our discussions into the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, Ruth, everybody, and to be continued. Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye.